a teenage emperor. Dozens of boys, one order, blind them all. Ethiopia, 1740, a dynasty torn apart by a ruler who saw too much in every heir. He was just 7 years old when the crown was lowered onto his head. The palace scribes called it divine succession. The priests said it was the will of Solomon himself, a bloodline that stretched from Jerusalem to the highlands of Ethiopia. But in truth, the boy who became Emperor Iyasu II in 1721 didn't inherit power, his mother did. Her name was Mentawab, and in many ways, she ruled more firmly than any man before her. She held court. She commanded generals, and when the nobles muttered behind silk curtains, she reminded them who gave them their land. Young Iyasu watched it all, from behind pillars and beside thrones too large for his feet to touch the floor. He was crowned emperor, but rarely spoke. He learned to rule from the sidelines, but he also learned to fear the center, because in Gondar, the royal capital, the crown was always heavier than it looked. Court rivals, generals, and sons of old emperors still roamed the palace halls, waiting, watching. By the time he was 20, Iyasu had become something else entirely. A ruler convinced that power wasn't something you kept, it was something you defended. And in a world where a bloodline was everything, defending power meant destroying possibility, even if that possibility had a child's face. No one knows where it happened. Some say it was a side chamber of the old palace, a closed-off, soundproofed and windowless room. Others whispered of makeshift clinics on the outskirts of Gondar. But what they agree on is this: it was not a single act, it was a purge. One by one, young boys were brought in, some noble-born, some royal cousins, others merely gifted, some no older than 5, others already training in arms or scripture. They were escorted by soldiers who didn't speak. The doors closed behind them, and when they opened again, the boys stumbled out, changed. Their eyes were bloodied or gone, in some cases seared shut with herbal paste or hot iron. A few were carried out unconscious. Many didn't scream. Those who did were never heard from again. Ethiopian court tradition held that a ruler must be physically whole to wear the crown. A limp, a deformity, or even a scarred face could end a dynasty. Blinding a rival was the most efficient form of erasure, both spiritual and legal at once. Emperor Iyasu II didn't invent this logic, but he perfected it. Chroniclers from the time wrote cautiously, in passive voice. The eyes of several were removed. The blessings of succession were interrupted. But foreign missionaries were more direct. In a letter smuggled back to Lisbon, one Jesuit priest wrote, "The emperor has taken to extinguishing futures. His court is not a court. It is a graveyard of sight." No charges were brought against Iyasu and the boys. Once promising heirs or scholars were cast out, cared for by monasteries or wandering silently through the markets, their eye sockets hollowed. Iyasu's court remained calm, but there was a growing fear, as each noble father wondered, would his son be next? Iyasu II ruled for over 3 decades, but those years passed like water through clenched fists, and the empire slowly frayed. Governors began withholding tribute. The war frontiers grew restless. Priests who once bowed began asking quiet questions. Even inside the palace, silence started meaning fear. By the 1750s, Iyasu's health began to decline. He was barely 40. His body had grown thin. His eyes, once sharp and unblinking, now darted with suspicion. And still, his court remained curiously quiet. All his competition was gone, blinded, scattered, or too afraid to show their faces. The emperor had severed every branch from the royal tree and now sat alone on a throne without successors. When he died in 1755, it happened quickly. Some say it was fever, others say poison, a final act of quiet rebellion. His teenage son, Iyoas I, was crowned. But the damage was done. The court that Iyasu left behind was brittle, leaderless, and swollen with old resentments. Within a year, civil war erupted. Factions formed overnight. And Ethiopia entered one of its darkest eras, a period historians would later call the Zemene Mesafint, or the era of the princes, a century of warlords, puppets, and shattered dynasties. Iyasu had ruled by removing futures, but the future didn't vanish. It just came back with knives. His reign left no legacy, only the quiet question carved into memory, what do you build, when all you know how to do is destroy? The exam was everything. In 19th century China, it didn't matter where you were born or how rich your family was. If you passed the civil service exam, you could become someone. If you failed, you were nobody. Hong Yuquan failed it 4 times. Each failure pushed him deeper into shame. His family sold what little they had to pay for tutors. But the questions, mostly ancient Confucian philosophy, didn't make sense to him, not in the way they were supposed to. And after his final failure in 1837, Hong collapsed. For weeks he lay in bed, sweating, delirious, speaking nonsense. His family thought he was dying. When he woke up, he said he'd been somewhere else. He spoke of a radiant kingdom in the sky, a golden throne, a bearded god who called him my son, a robed figure beside him who introduced himself as Jesus. He said he had been shown visions, cities of sin, demonic emperors, a dragon devouring the land. No one around him knew what to make of it, so they didn't say much at all. Hong returned to life quietly. He got a job teaching village children. He read pamphlets from Protestant missionaries, not quite understanding them, but absorbing enough to reshape his visions. And in his own mind, things began to settle into a new truth. He had failed the world's test because he was meant to rewrite the world. By the time Hong Yuquan was in his 30s, he saw himself as someone sent to fulfill visions. He began preaching in villages outside Guangzhou with the message: the Qing dynasty was evil. China had lost the mandate of heaven, and the one true kingdom on earth could only be built by God's chosen servant. That servant, he said, was himself, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the heavenly king. At first, people laughed. Then they started listening. Peasants, displaced workers, women, soldiers, men who had lost their land, families who had lost their sons, people who had nothing left but a need to believe in something bigger than the empire that had failed them. His movement spread fast and dangerously wide. By 1850, it had a military wing. By 1851, it had a name, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And by 1853, it had a capital. They took Nanjing, the southern heart of Qing China, and renamed it Tianjin, or Heavenly Capital. By the mid-1850s, the Heavenly Kingdom stretched across 600 cities and 30 million people. Hong now ruled millions, and he governed like a prophet. He banned opium, gambling, alcohol, and prostitution. He abolished private property and burned Confucian texts. There were rules for everything: how to speak, pray, dress, even how to dream. But his most personal obsession was control over sex. Not just immoral sex, all sex. Men and women were forcibly separated both in public and in private. Married couples were required to live apart. Physical intimacy was allowed only with official approval and only if it aligned with divine timing. Hong's followers were told that the body was a vessel for sin, and desire was a distraction planted by demons. Violation of these rules meant public beatings, imprisonment, or execution. But the policy created problems fast. Unmarried men outnumbered women in the military camps 10 to 1. Tension rose, and so did assaults. And within the capital, forced separations led to black market brothels and hidden relationships, some of them involving Hong's own officers. His regime responded by tightening enforcement with public whippings, spies in housing blocks, and stonings. And through it all, Hong remained sealed inside his palace, writing new edicts, while the city beneath him strained under repression. He had promised heaven, but what he delivered was a kingdom of unnatural rules. By the time the war reached its 10th year, the heavenly kingdom was already falling in on itself. As the heavenly kingdom grew, Hong Yuquan began to disappear from the public and his own officials. He surrounded himself with guards and sealed himself inside a palace compound. Only scribes were allowed inside, and only to collect his writings. Most of his time was spent in meditation, prayer, and dictating new laws. He renamed days of the week, rewrote calendars, created new rituals, uniforms, and punishments. Beyond the city walls, the real war was turning apocalyptic. The Taiping armies had once swept across southern China like a divine flood. Now they were bleeding men with every step. Cities fell with mass executions. Civilians were slaughtered for giving water to the wrong soldier. Villages were burned for failing to pledge allegiance fast enough. Some changed hands a dozen times, and each time with fewer people left alive to surrender. The countryside was filled with corpses, and the rivers ran black with ash. Starvation followed everything. Refugees filled the roads, eating grass and dirt and each other. Inside Tianjin, the heavenly capital, the famine was no better. And while his followers starved in the streets, Hong stockpiled fruit in his chambers. He said they were offerings from heaven. No one dared eat them. Outside his walls, his lieutenants began to fracture. His generals questioned one another's loyalty. His top advisor, Yang Xiuqing, began claiming he too could speak to God, and that God had issued new instructions. Hong didn't argue. He ordered Yang murdered in the night. A purge followed. Thousands of soldiers and officials were executed for alleged disloyalty. Entire command structures vanished in a matter of days. By the time Qing forces began surrounding the capital, Tianjin was already falling apart from starvation, disease, and indiscipline. And Hong still refused to leave his chambers. When his generals begged for guidance, they received scrolls, verses copied from memory. When they asked for weapons, they received scripture. Hong believed salvation would come, but in June of 1864, the gates of his kingdom were breached. And by then, it was too late. They found him dead in his palace. Some said he'd poisoned himself. Others believed he starved, surrounded by the fruit he never touched. When the heavenly capital fell, there was no final battle. The few loyalists who survived carried Hong Xiuquan's body into a shallow grave outside the palace walls. His officials tried to hide the truth. They claimed he had descended, that his death was a test of faith, that the kingdom would rise again. None of it mattered. The Qing army swept through Tianjin in a storm of retribution. Men, women, and children were executed in the streets. The death toll of the rebellion, the war Hong started, the war he stopped leading, was catastrophic. More than 20 million people were dead, a toll surpassing even that of World War I. All in the name of a false messiah, a man who claimed to be the brother of Jesus, but died hoarding fruit at the center of a kingdom that had collapsed long before his body did. He wore his uniform to bed. Even in private, Rafael Trujillo dressed like a soldier. Epaulets, medals, stiff leather gloves, all spotless. To him, a true ruler was never off duty. In 1916, the United States invaded the Dominican Republic to protect American sugar and debt interests. They stayed for 8 years, and in that time they built a new army. Trujillo joined it. He rose quickly because he was useful. He smiled for Americans and crushed Dominican dissent without hesitation. By the time the U.S. pulled out in 1924, Trujillo was chief of the National Police and soon after head of the army. In 1930, as unrest boiled in the capital, Trujillo positioned himself as the protector of order. He told then-President Horacio Vázquez that he would remain neutral while rebels marched on the city. Privately, he was the one funding them. When the president fled, Trujillo was the last man standing. In the next election, he became president with more than 99% of the vote. But president wasn't enough. He renamed streets, provinces, the tallest mountain, and even the capital itself. Santo Domingo became Ciudad Trujillo, Trujillo City. He had his face stamped on coins, his name on textbooks, and statues of himself in every public square. School children were taught to recite blessings in his name. Weddings opened with tributes to his leadership. Newborns were given names like Trujillito or Rafaelina by decree. And then came the moon. One evening after dinner with foreign diplomats, Trujillo stood on a palace balcony, looked up, and reportedly said, "That too should belong to me." The next morning, state media ran stories claiming the moon as part of Trujillo's celestial dominion. He had conquered the land, the people, and now, symbolically, the sky. Ridiculous. But no one dared laugh. It was all strategic. And Trujillismo, his personality cult, was a new national policy. By 1937, his control was absolute, and that's when he gave the order that made him unforgettable. At the border with Haiti, he claimed farmers were letting undesirables into the country, black Haitians. He told his soldiers to check for accents. If a man couldn't pronounce the Spanish word for parsley like a Dominican, they were killed. Over the next week, more than 20,000 Haitians were slaughtered with machetes to make it look like a civilian conflict. The world barely noticed. Trujillo just smiled and gave himself a new title, benefactor of the fatherland. And in the Dominican Republic, you didn't speak above a whisper, especially when the moon was full. They called it the National Festival of Beauty. In public, it was a pageant. In private, it was a catalog. Rafael Trujillo used the presidency like a mirror, always watching himself, always asking who was watching him. But it wasn't admiration he craved, it was control. Teenage girls from across the Dominican Republic were brought to state dinners under the pretense of patriotism. Each one was vetted for beauty. Some were told it was an honor and others were told nothing at all. And once they were in his orbit, leaving wasn't a choice. He called them visits. They took place in private villas, walled-off estates, rooms where the radio played just loud enough to cover the sound of what was happening. Trujillo believed that because he was the state, anything he wanted was policy. His desires became doctrine. He married, remarried, kept mistresses, and still, it wasn't enough. He built an entire wing of his regime around procurement. Officials were tasked with identifying potential girls. Some underage and others were daughters of political enemies, taken as punishment. One girl tried to escape. Trujillo had her father arrested. Another refused to attend a dinner. Her brother disappeared. What he couldn't seduce, he erased. Even now, the full scale of what he did is hard to measure, but the pattern is clear. A man who claimed to defend the dignity of the nation, while privately treating its daughters as proof of his power. The assassins thought it would be quick. The hit would go down on a quiet stretch of road outside Santo Domingo. On the day, a convoy approached and men waited in the brush with rifles. It was May 30th, 1961, and after 31 years in power, Rafael Trujillo was finally vulnerable. He wasn't traveling with bodyguards that night. He was going to visit a woman, the same mistake he'd made 1,000 times. But this time, someone had decided it would be his last. The ambush began with a shot to the tires, then bullets through the windshield, but even as the glass shattered, Trujillo didn't go down, he fought back. Some accounts say he tried to run, others say he reached for a gun. Either way, he didn't die right away. It took multiple shots and time. In the end, he bled out on the side of the road, alone and furious. The next day, his son Ramfis Trujillo returned from Paris and brought hell with him. Over the following weeks, suspected conspirators were hunted down, tortured, and executed. Some were killed in secret and others died screaming in prison cells. A few were buried quietly until Ramfis had their bodies exhumed, stripped, and hung upside down in public, a final warning to anyone still loyal to the idea of freedom. The regime turned brutal again, but briefly. There was no father at the center now. By the end of the year, the statues were gone. The portraits were burned and the capital city reclaimed its name. Ciudad Trujillo became Santo Domingo again, and the moon, the one he once joked belonged to him, kept rising on a country that finally stopped saying his name out loud.